She was nobody. A ghost in a uniform, scrubbing marble floors inside a penthouse worth more than her entire life. Then she hummed. 4 quiet notes. An old Sicilian lullaby her dying grandmother pressed into her memory like a scar. She didn't know what those notes meant. She didn't know they belonged to a bloodline that powerful men had spent 30 years trying to erase. She didn't know the man standing behind her, the man who ran half of Chicago's underworld with nothing but silence and violence, had just stopped breathing. Because that song was supposed to be dead. And so was the family that sang it. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now, drop your city in the comments below, and let me see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because what happens next will change everything. The alarm went off at 4:15 in the morning, same as every other morning, and Alara Moretti lay in the dark for exactly 30 seconds before she made herself get up. Not because she wanted to. She never wanted to. The wanting had been scraped out of her somewhere around the 3rd month after her mother died, when the hospital bills started arriving in envelopes that felt deliberately heavy, like they were trying to crush her through the mailbox. She got up because Noah was in the next room, and Noah needed his medication refilled by Thursday, and the medication cost $240 even with the discount card, and she had exactly $112 in her checking account. So she got up. The apartment was a 1-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a building on West Huron that smelled like other people's cooking and old carpet. She'd given Noah the bedroom. She slept on a fold-out couch that left a ridge across her lower back that never fully went away. She'd stopped noticing it 6 months ago, which was either adaptation or defeat. She couldn't decide which anymore. She dressed in the bathroom so the light wouldn't wake him. Work uniform, gray pants, gray shirt, the little laminated ID badge from Apex Residential Services that had her name printed in font so small it looked like an apology. She pulled her dark hair back with a rubber band, looked at herself in the mirror for half a second, and then looked away, not out of vanity, but efficiency. There was nothing useful in that reflection. She was out the door by 4:38. The L was nearly empty at that hour. She sat with her bag on her lap and watched the city scroll past the scratched windows. Parking lots, back alleys, the smear of streetlights on wet pavement. Chicago in November had a particular cruelty to it, the cold working through every gap in your clothing like it was specifically interested in finding your weak points. She'd grown up here. She knew better than to be surprised by it. She'd been with Apex for 3 years. Before that, 2 years at a commercial cleaning company downtown. Before that, a semester and a half of community college, until the money ran out and Noah's first hospitalization happened and the entire structure of what she'd been building quietly collapsed. She was 25 years old and she had learned, at great cost, that plans were a kind of fiction you told yourself to get through the present moment. The only thing she knew how to do was work. Apex serviced 14 luxury residential properties across the near North Side and the Gold Coast. She had 6 units on her Monday, Wednesday, Friday rotation. The Valenti building on East Erie was always last, always saved for last, not because of any logical scheduling reason, but because she had developed over 8 months a private superstition about it. Something about that building made the back of her neck prickle. She'd learned to save it for when she was tired enough not to think too carefully about why. The building was 42 stories of dark glass and poured concrete, the kind of architecture that looked less like somewhere people lived and more like a monument to the idea of living a certain way. The lobby had a fountain, an actual indoor fountain, with smooth river stones and recessed lighting and the kind of silence that money buys. The overnight concierge buzzed her through without looking up from his phone. She took the service elevator to 38. The penthouse units on the top 4 floors were on a separate cleaning protocol, not the standard rotation, but scheduled individually and logged in a separate system she never had access to. She'd been assigned to Unit 3801 for the first time 2 weeks ago, and again last Friday, and now again today. She'd asked her supervisor once about the occupancy status of the unit, and he'd looked at her with an expression that suggested the question itself was slightly inappropriate. "Just clean it," he'd said. "Don't touch anything on the desk. Don't open any closed doors, in and out." She hadn't asked again. The key card worked on the first try. She let herself in and stood for a moment in the entry hall, the way she always did in new spaces, taking inventory. The lights were on low, the automatic system, not a person. The air smelled faintly of cedar and something sharper underneath it, Something she couldn't name. Expensive. That was the only word she had for it. Whatever it was, it cost more than she made in a month. The penthouse was large and aggressively minimal. Clean lines, dark wood, furniture that looked like it had been chosen by someone who cared more about geometry than comfort. The kitchen was restaurant grade, stainless and cold. The living area faced floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake, which at 5:15 in the morning was a flat black sheet that absorbed the city lights without giving anything back. She started the way she always started, kitchen first, then bathrooms, then the main rooms. She worked without turning on additional lights, had learned to navigate by the ambient glow of the city outside. It was faster this way, less visible. She'd gotten very good at being invisible. The primary bathroom was marble, floor, walls, ceiling, the full commitment. She sprayed the surfaces and wiped them down with movements so habitual they required no thought, which was the only time she ever let herself drift. When her hands knew what they were doing without her, her mind went somewhere else. Usually nowhere pleasant. Usually to the discharge summary from Noah's last pulmonology appointment, or to the specific phrasing of the collections notice she'd gotten last week, or to the memory of her mother's hands, which had been rough the same way hers were rough, from the same kind of work. Her grandmother's hands had been different. Nonna Lucia's hands had been soft in a way that seemed almost deliberate, like she'd protected them against something. She'd had a ring she never took off, a flat silver band with no stone, worn down so smooth it looked liquid. She'd died 2 years ago, in the winter, in a hospital bed in Oak Park with the television going and nobody else in the room because Alara had been at work and hadn't made it in time. That was the failure she carried heaviest. Not the bills, not the apartment, not any of it. The fact that her grandmother had died alone. Nonna Lucia had never talked about Sicily. Not in any specific way. General things. The light there, the smell of certain herbs, the way sound carried differently over water. But the songs she knew, she sang them like they were obligations. Low and careful, always when she thought no one was listening. Old melodies in a dialect so specific, Alara had never been able to find it in any translation app. Syllables that felt less like language and more like sequence. Alara had learned them the way children learn things, by osmosis, repetition, without understanding. They sat in her memory like objects in a room she rarely entered. She was working on the living room windows, a full panel of floor-to-ceiling glass, 14 feet high, requiring the extension squeegee, when it started. Not a decision, not even entirely conscious. She was tired and her back hurt, and the window was tall and her mind had gone to that place where it required something to latch onto, and what it latched onto was the melody. Just the first phrase. 4 notes descending, a 5th held, a return. Her grandmother's hands on her shoulders. The smell of the kitchen on Via Salerno that she'd never actually been to, but could somehow remember anyway, maybe through the stories, or maybe through some biological channel she had no name for. She hummed it almost silently. Barely breath. Then a little louder. The acoustics in the penthouse were strange, and the glass and hard surfaces bouncing the sound back at her in layers, making it fuller than she intended. She hummed the second phrase. The third. She didn't hear him come in. She didn't hear anything. Not the elevator, not the door, not footsteps across the stone floor. There was no warning at all. One moment the room behind her was empty. The next moment it was not. She felt it before she knew it. A change in the air pressure, a quality of stillness that wasn't the stillness of an empty room. The particular stillness of a person who has chosen not to move. She turned. He was standing in his hallway between the entry and the living area, still wearing an overcoat, black, the kind that cost as much as her car. He was tall, several inches over 6 feet, and the low light caught the angles of his face in a way that made him look like something carved rather than born. Dark eyes, dark hair, short on the sides. A jaw that looked like it had been designed with deliberate emphasis on unpleasantness. He was staring at her, not at her face, not her uniform, or the cleaning equipment, or any of the obvious things. He was staring at the space around her, or through her, or at something she couldn't see that she apparently occupied. His expression was, she couldn't find the word, not anger, not surprise. Something older than both of those things. Something that looked like a wound being reopened very slowly. The extension squeegee was still in her hand. She lowered it. I'm sorry, she said. I didn't know anyone was. I'm from Apex. I have a scheduled. Stop. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that didn't need volume because it had some other quality that made hearing it feel mandatory. What was that? She blinked. Sir? What you were singing. He still hadn't moved. What was that? She felt the hair on her arm stand up under the gray uniform. Not from fear exactly, though fear was certainly present, but from the specific quality of his focus, which was total and absolute in a way that made her feel like the rest of the world had been edited out. It's nothing. An old song. My grandmother taught me. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have. Where was your grandmother from? It wasn't a question. The inflection was wrong for a question. It was the sentence structure of someone who already has a theory and needs it confirmed or destroyed. Sicily, she said, but she came here a long time ago. Something moved in his face. Not an expression she could name, a kind of controlled collapse. He said, what was her name? The squeegee was slippery in her palm. She realized she'd been gripping it hard enough that her knuckles had gone pale. Lucia, she said. Lucia Moretti. Before that, I don't know what her surname was before. He made a sound. Not quite a word. Not quite anything identifiable. He turned away from her very abruptly and walked to the windows, where the lake was still dark and the city lights still swam on its surface, and he stood there with his back to her for a long time. She didn't move. She was very aware of the exit, which was behind him and to his left, approximately 20 feet. She was very aware of the fact that she was in a penthouse at 5:30 in the morning with a man whose name she didn't know and who had just looked at her in a way that made her feel both seen and in tremendous danger. You can go, he said finally, still with his back to her. Leave your equipment. You'll be rescheduled. She didn't argue. She set down the squeegee carefully, retrieved her bag from the kitchen, and made it to the elevator before she let herself breathe properly. She didn't find out his name until that afternoon. She found it by accident, the way you find things that were meant to stay hidden, through a series of small, careless steps taken by people who thought they were being careful. She was in the Apex scheduling office, picking up her updated assignment sheet when she overheard two of the building's full-time staff talking in the break room next door. They were talking about a car that had been damaged in the garage. They were talking about who owned the car. And they said the name with the specific carefulness that people use when they say names that carry weight. Valenti. Dominic Valenti. She looked it up on her phone on the train home. Not for long. She didn't need to read more than 3 paragraphs before her hands started shaking. Noah was awake when she got back, which was unusual. He was sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open and a cup of tea that had clearly gone cold, wrapped in the oversized sweatshirt he wore when his breathing was giving him trouble. He was 22 and he looked younger, thin in the way that chronic illness makes people thin, not wasted but streamlined somehow, the body organizing itself around its own maintenance. He had their mother's eyes, which was something Alara couldn't look at directly for too long. You're early, he said. Got rescheduled. She set her bag down. How are you doing? Breathing. He said it the same way he always said it, like a joke that had been funny once and now served a different function. Rescheduled from where? The Erie building. The fancy one? Yeah. He looked at her. Noah had an inconvenient perceptiveness that she'd never figured out how to manage. He'd always been better at reading her than she was at presenting a neutral face to him, which was one of the genuinely unfair things about their particular dynamic. Something happened, he said. Nothing happened. Ilara, I need to make dinner. It's 3 p.m. She stood at the counter with her back to him and pressed her hands flat against the laminate surface and focused on the sensation of the cold under her palms. She heard him shift in his chair. She heard him not push further, which was something she'd trained him to do over years of deflection, and which she felt guilty about on a nearly daily basis. Your medication, she said. I'm going to call about the authorization. There's a different tier we might qualify for. Okay. And the rent is manageable this month if I pick up the Saturday morning shift at the River North building. Okay. Noah. Yeah. She turned around. He was watching her with his cold tea and his too large sweatshirt and his perceptive eyes, and she wanted very badly to tell him everything, and she was not going to tell him anything. It's going to be fine, she said. He nodded. He didn't believe her. That was the agreement they had. She said it. He nodded. Neither of them examined the claim too closely. She went to her couch and sat down and looked at her phone for a long time without opening any apps. The name sat in her head with a specific gravity. Dominic Valenti. 42 years old. Based in Chicago, but with connections, this was the word the articles used, connections, to half a dozen other cities and 2 foreign countries. The legitimate business interests were real, but the articles navigated around the edges of what he actually did with the particular sidestep of journalists who are being careful. Nobody had ever convicted him of anything. Nobody had gotten close enough to try. The name of his family's organization was never printed directly. It was referred to as the Valenti Network, the Valenti interests, the Valenti sphere of influence, which extended, according to one piece she found from 4 years ago, from the ports to the hotels to 3 separate union structures and a collection of financial instruments that a forensic accountant had tried to untangle in a federal proceeding and given up. This was the man who had looked at her like her voice was a ghost. Her phone buzzed. She didn't recognize the number. She looked at it for 2 full rings before she answered. Ms. Moretti? A man's voice. Not Dominic's, different, older, with a precision of diction that suggested education or training or both. My name is Enzo. I work for Mr. Valenti. He'd like to invite you to a gathering this evening at the Marquette Club on Michigan Avenue. Transportation will be arranged from your current address. She stood up. She hadn't decided to stand. Her body just did it. How do you have this number? Mr. Valenti finds it important to know certain things about the people who work in his building. This isn't unusual. I'm not going to any... Ms. Moretti. The precision remained unchanged. He also wanted me to tell you that he knew your grandmother's name before it was Lucia Moretti. He thought that information might be relevant to your decision. The kitchen was very quiet. Noah had gone to his room. The refrigerator hummed. The traffic was distant enough to be almost atmospheric. What name? She said. That he'd prefer to tell you in person. She stood there for a long time after the call ended. Then she went to the bathroom and looked at herself in the mirror again, which she almost never did, and tried to find something in her face that would tell her what to do. She looked ordinary. That was the problem. She had always looked ordinary, dark hair, brown eyes, a face that was composed rather than remarkable, hands that were starting to roughen at the knuckles the same way her grandmother's had been rough. The laminated badge from Apex still clipped to her shirt. She took the badge off and set it on the sink. Enzo had not been lying about the transportation. A black car arrived at 6:58, a full 2 minutes before the time he'd given her, which she found either reassuring or ominous and couldn't decide which. The driver didn't speak. The interior smelled like the penthouse, that cedar and something sharp combination she still couldn't identify. The Marquette Club was on Michigan Avenue, one of those buildings that didn't need to announce itself because everyone who needed to know already did. Stone facade, brass fittings, the kind of doorman who looked at you with a professional assessment speed that was genuinely impressive. She'd cleaned office buildings in this neighborhood for 2 years, and she'd never been inside one of these. She was wearing the only dress she owned that qualified for this environment. Navy blue, bought for a job interview 3 years ago that she hadn't gotten. It still fit. She'd found shoes at the back of the closet. She'd told Noah she had a work function, which was technically true in every way that mattered. Enzo met her in the lobby. He was about 60, compact and precise, with the kind of face that had been trained out of expressiveness a long time ago. Ms. Moretti. He examined her for exactly the right amount of time. Please follow me. The gathering was in a private dining room on the 2nd floor. She heard it before she saw it. The layered sound of many concurrent conversations, a specific frequency of social performance. The room itself was paneled wood and candlelight, 20 or so people arranged around clusters of furniture, drinks in hand, in clothing that represented a serious economic upper boundary. She was aware of heads turning as she entered, of the brief recalibration that happened in people's expressions when they placed her. Not quite right. Not quite one of us. She'd learned to absorb that sensation in her early 20s when she'd worked banquet service, and it had been directed at her deliberately. She absorbed it now. Dominic was across the room. He'd changed from the overcoat to a dark suit that was understated in the specific way that certain expensive things achieve understatement by eliminating anything unnecessary. He was talking to two men near the window, and he had his back partly to the door, but he turned the moment she entered as if he'd sensed the disturbance. He crossed the room with a directness that cleared a path through the social currents without appearing to try. Around him, conversations slowed, realigned, found new trajectories. She watched it happen and understood, in a physical way that she hadn't entirely from the articles, that this was what authority looked like when it was entirely internalized. Not performance, not effort, just gravity. He stopped 2 feet from her. "You came," he said. "You said you knew her other name." "I did." He studied her face the way he had in the penthouse. Not unnerving exactly, but total. "Before we discuss that, I want to understand what you know." "About what?" "About where your family is from. What they did. Who they were." She kept her voice flat. "I know my grandmother came from Sicily. She never talked about it. She sang old songs and made bread on Sundays and died in a hospital room in Oak Park 2 years ago. That's what I know." "Did she ever tell you where in Sicily? A city or a town?" "I don't remember the name." "Did she ever mention the name Montanari?" The room around them continued its overlapping conversations, its crystal glasses, its performance of ease. She felt none of that. "No," she said. Dominic nodded slowly, as if she'd confirmed something rather than denied it. "Your grandmother's name before she came to America," he said, "was Lucia Montanari. She was the youngest daughter of a family that 30 years ago controlled significant territories across the western provinces of Sicily and had interests extending into 3 countries. They were influential in ways that made them targets. In 1994, there was an orchestrated attack, political in its planning, violent in its execution. The entire family was eliminated, houses, properties, accounts, all seized or destroyed. "Perciò mai he paused. Everyone believed the bloodline ended. Her hands were very still at her sides. She was focusing on keeping them that way. "You're telling me," she said carefully, "that my grandmother was a Montanari." "Yes." He watched her absorb this. "Which means you are the last surviving heir of a dynasty that powerful people worked very hard to erase." "That's not—" She stopped, started again. "You're describing things that have nothing to do with me. I clean apartments for a living. My brother is sick. I know what you are." He said it without cruelty, which somehow made it heavier. "I also know what you were born into. Those 2 things are going to have a conversation very soon, whether you're ready for it or not." He looked away briefly, at the window, at the dark street below. "Someone else recognized you today. Not from your face, from the song. You were heard. I don't know yet who passed that information, but by tomorrow, there will be people asking questions about you that you're not equipped to answer." The cold from the November street seemed to have come in with her somehow. "What kind of people?" she said. "The kind that finished the job in 1994, he said. "Or their employers, or both." He met her eyes. "I'm telling you this because I have my own history with the Montanari name, and because the song you were singing in my apartment this morning has not been sung by anyone living in 30 years. Something crossed his face that she still didn't have a name for. "Your grandmother protected you by keeping you invisible. That protection ends tonight." The room had gotten quieter around them. She noticed it peripherally, conversations finding other directions, the social weather shifting. "What do you want from me?" she said. He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, considering. "Nothing you're not willing to give," he said. "But you need to understand what you are first, and you need to understand it quickly." She stood in her 3-year-old interview dress in a room full of people who would never clean anyone's windows. And she thought about Noah's sweatshirt and his cold tea and his perceptive eyes, and she thought about her grandmother's hands. Soft hands, protected hands, hands that had carried something they'd never passed on directly. She thought about the song, 4 descending notes, a 5th held, a return. "Tell me everything," she said. He didn't tell her everything that night. He told her enough. The Montanari family had not been criminals in the conventional sense, he explained. or not primarily. They had operated in the complex space between legitimate influence and organized power that defined the upper structure of Sicilian society in the latter half of the 20th century. Land, agriculture, certain port interests, political relationships that were never formalized but were universally understood. And something else, a system of documentation built over decades that cataloged the financial and political arrangements of virtually every significant power structure in Sicily and southern Italy. Agreements, payments, records of decisions that could not survive public scrutiny. The Montanari patriarch, Ilara's great-grandfather, had understood very early that the most dangerous thing a family could possess was not territory or wealth, but knowledge. He had built a library of accountability over 40 years, and he had hidden it. Hidden how? Ilara said. They'd moved to a smaller room, just the two of them, and Enzo standing near the door with the specific posture of someone who was simultaneously present and professionally invisible. Dominic had a drink he hadn't touched. That's what no one has been able to determine, he said. The family was gone. The properties were seized. Every physical record was destroyed or taken. But the information itself, he paused. There are people who have spent 30 years believing it was destroyed, and people who have spent 30 years believing it wasn't. And the song. He looked at her. You said I was recognized from the song, not my face. She held his gaze steadily. That means the song matters. Not just because my grandmother sang it. He was quiet for long enough that she understood the quiet was its own kind of answer. The songs your grandmother taught you, he said finally. All of them. How many? 7? Maybe 8. I'd have to think. She watched his face. They're a code. We believe so. Yes. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling, which was ornate in the way of places that had been designed to impress people who already had everything. The specific absurdity of the situation moved through her in a wave. The gray uniform, the fold-out couch, the medication costs and the collections notices, and the years of holding everything together by her fingernails, and underneath all of it, apparently, a 30-year-old secret stitched into lullabies. My grandmother knew what she was carrying, she said. Yes. And she never told me. She kept you safe. He said it carefully, as if he understood the texture of what that cost her. She kept me ignorant, she said. There was no anger in it, just precision. He didn't argue with that. I need you to think, he said, about whether there were other things, beyond the songs, objects she kept, letters, anything that seemed ordinary but that she was particular about. The ring, Ilara said immediately. He went still. Silver band, no stone. She wore it every day. She looked at her own hands. I have it. I have it in a box at the apartment. She was wearing it when she died, and the hospital put it with her effects. Dominic set down the untouched drink. That ring, he said, and his voice had changed. Not dramatically, just a degree of tension that hadn't been there before. Is almost certainly not just a ring. She understood then. Not everything. Not even most of it. But enough to understand that the life she had been living for 3 years had been constructed on top of something she hadn't known was there. Like cleaning someone else's floors for months without knowing what was under them. Someone's going to come for me, she said. Yes. For Noah. His jaw tightened fractionally. Yes. She looked at him across the small table in the quiet room, while the gathering continued in the other room and Chicago pressed its cold weight against the windows. What does protecting us look like? She said. It looks like coming with me. He held her gaze without flinching. Both of you. Tonight. She thought about the apartment on West Huron, the fold-out couch, the ridge across her back, the medication schedule she'd memorized, the collected weight of the ordinary life she'd assembled out of whatever she could afford. Then she thought about her grandmother's hands, soft, protected, carrying something silently for 30 years across an ocean. The ring was in a box in the back of the closet. She stood up. Give me an hour, she said. What she didn't know, couldn't know yet, was that she'd already been followed from the apartment, that the car that had passed West Huron Street twice while she was packing was not a coincidence, that the phone call Enzo received at 11:47 that night, which made his carefully constructed face go briefly slack before it reassembled, was about something that had happened 4 blocks from her building, that the protection Dominic was offering had a window, and the window was already closing. The hour she'd asked for took 43 minutes. Elara moved through the apartment on West Huron with the specific economy of someone who had learned that attachment to objects was a luxury she couldn't afford. She pulled Noah's medications first, the inhaler, the 2 prescription bottles, the nebulizer that had to be disassembled and packed in its original case or it didn't fit anywhere. Then his laptop, his external drive, the folder of medical records she kept in a manila envelope behind the cookbooks because that had seemed like a safe place once. Noah stood in the doorway of his bedroom watching her. Elara, pack a bag, 3 days minimum. It's 11 o'clock at night. I know what time it is. Who is that man downstairs? She stopped, turned. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the expression he made when he'd already decided not to be manageable, which was the expression she feared most because she had no good counter for it. His name is Dominic Valenti, she said. We need to go with him tonight. The silence that followed had weight. Valenti, Noah said. He said it the way she had said it on the train home, turning it over, feeling its edges. He was 22, but he read things, absorbed things, connected things faster than most people she knew. That Valenti? Yes. Elara, that man. I know who he is. Do you? He pushed off the doorframe. Because what I know about him from 3 seconds on Google is enough to know that whatever he's offering, it costs something. Everything costs something, Noah. She turned back to the cabinet. Pack the bag. Tell me what's happening. I'll tell you in the car. Tell me now. She stopped again. The medications were in her hands. The apartment around her was its familiar self. The worn counter, the window with the bad seal that let in a thread of cold air, the water stain on the ceiling above the table that she'd looked at for 2 years without ever getting fixed. She'd thought of this place as temporary since the first week. Somehow, it had become the shape of her life. Nonna Lucia wasn't who we thought she was, she said. Or, she was. But there was more, her family back in Sicily. There are people who know she had family here, and now they know about me. She made herself look at him directly. We're not safe here tonight. He held her gaze for a long moment. His breathing was controlled. She monitored it automatically, the faint labor of it, the slight elevation that came with stress. How long have you known this? He said. Since this morning. Something moved in his face. Not anger. Something quieter and sharper than anger. The particular expression of someone recalculating the architecture of their trust. Okay, he said. He went to pack. She found the ring in the back of the closet, in the small cardboard box the hospital had given her with Nonna Lucia's effects. Silver band, no stone, worn smooth. She held it in her palm for a moment. It weighed almost nothing. She put it in the inside pocket of her jacket. The car that had been idling on West Huron was gone by the time they came down. Elara noticed its absence before she noticed anything else. The empty stretch of curb where it had been, the faint residue of exhaust still visible in the cold air. She registered this and said nothing. Dominic's car was at the end of the block. He was outside it, which surprised her. Standing on the sidewalk in the cold with his hands in his coat pockets, not visibly tense, but not relaxed either. He watched them come toward him with an expression that was doing careful work. Noah stopped walking about 10 feet away. The two of them looked at each other. Dominic with his particular gravitational stillness, Noah with his arms crossed, and his jaw doing the thing it did. You're the brother, Dominic said. Yes, said Noah. You're sick. Noah blinked. What? Not an insult, information. It affects logistics. Dominic looked at Elara. The driver who followed you from the Marquette Club was picked up 2 blocks from here. He's not going to say much, but the fact that he was there tells us the window is shorter than I thought. Followed from, she processed this. Someone at the gathering. Someone who recognized what I recognized this morning, or someone who received a message. His jaw tightened. We'll determine which later. Right now we need to move. Noah was still looking at him. You're saying someone is coming to this apartment. I'm saying someone already knows this address. Dominic opened the car door, which is why we're not staying in it. Noah looked at Elara. She gave him nothing. She'd made her decision. The only decision available when no good options exist and the bad options have varying degrees of consequence. She got in the car. After a moment, Noah followed. But they drove for 40 minutes, north and then west. The city thinning into suburbs and then into something that wasn't quite either. The car was silent in the way of people with too many things to say, and no agreed upon order to say them in. Enzo drove. Dominic sat in the front and said nothing. Alara sat in the back with Noah and watched the streetlights change character as they got further from the city. Noah fell asleep somewhere around the 45th minute, his head against the window, his breathing evening out into the specific rhythm she'd spent years monitoring from the other side of a wall. She watched him and felt the familiar mixture of ferocity and helplessness that was the texture of loving someone who was fragile in ways you couldn't fix. Dominic turned around. He looked at her in the dark of the car for a moment without speaking. He doesn't know the full history, he said, quietly enough not to carry. No. He'll need to. I know. The ring, he said. Did you bring it? She touched the front of her jacket. Yes. He nodded, turned back. The estate was east of Barrington, set back from a county road behind a gate that opened electronically without breaking the car's speed. The grounds were dark, which made them feel large. She could tell by the way the headlights didn't reach any exterior walls for several seconds after the gate. The house itself was low and wide, stone and timber, the kind of architecture that suggested age even if it wasn't particularly old. Inside, someone had left lights on. The rooms were furnished with the same deliberate minimalism as the penthouse, but warmer. Actual rugs, books on actual shelves, a fireplace in the main room that had been used recently enough that the grate still held gray ash. A woman appeared from the back of the house, mid-50s, brisk, with the kind of organizational precision that suggested she'd been managing this household for long enough that she'd stopped finding anything in it surprising. Mrs. Ferrara, Dominic said. The upstairs east wing, both rooms. Already? She assessed Alara with a professional efficiency, noted Noah's pallor and the slight labor of his breathing, and without changing her expression said, I'll have the humidifier running before you're up the stairs. Noah blinked. How did you? She's very good, Dominic said. They sat in the main room after Noah went up, Alara, Dominic, and Enzo, who stationed himself near the door with his hands clasped and his face doing its professional disappearing act. A fire had been built. The ring was on the table between them. Dominic looked at it the way you look at something that has been lost for a long time and is now slightly frightening because of what its return means. Your great-grandfather, he said, constructed the documentation archive over 40 years. Land transfers, financial arrangements, political agreements, evidence of decisions made by powerful people who could not survive those decisions becoming public. He paused. Before the family was destroyed in 1994, he hid the archive, not in a physical location that anyone has ever found, in a system. The songs, Alara said. The songs are part of it. We believe they contain encoded navigational information, coordinates, or sequences, or both. The ring is almost certainly a cipher component. He picked it up, turned it in his fingers. The interior surface caught the firelight. There are markings on the inside, worn but present. She leaned forward. He held it toward the light. She could see them. Hair-thin lines, more geometric than decorative, too deliberate to be damage. I carried that for 2 years, she said, in a box. Your grandmother carried it for 30. He set it down. And she never told a soul what it was. She told me the songs. Without explaining them, yes. He looked at her. She was protecting you, keeping you below the surface. She was keeping me useless, Alara said. Her voice came out harder than she intended. She heard it and didn't pull it back. If she'd told me, if I'd known even a fraction of this, you'd have been a target 20 years earlier. Noah would have better treatment. I wouldn't have been cleaning. She stopped, pressed her back teeth together. She made choices about my life without telling me what she was choosing. The fire moved. Nobody spoke. She also kept you alive, Dominic said. I know that. She looked at the ring on the table. I know that. I'm allowed to be angry about both. He didn't argue. She noted that. The man who ordered the 1994 attack, she said. Is he still operating? Dominic's expression shifted. Not much. A fraction. His name is Rafael Castellano, he said. He controls the eastern territories that were taken from the Montanari family. He's 71 years old, and he runs his operation through his son and 2 senior lieutenants. His voice had gone flat in a way that was distinct from his usual controlled tone. This flatness had history in it. He's been looking for the archive for 3 decades. He believed it was destroyed. Recent events, he paused. Recent events have suggested to him that it wasn't. What recent events? A researcher, an academic who had been quietly reconstructing the Montanari family history through genealogical records. She published a paper 14 months ago. She's been missing for 7 months. The fire crackled. Noah was somewhere above them, sleeping or trying to. Mrs. Ferrara was presumably doing whatever Mrs. Ferrara did. The world outside the stone house was dark and cold, and apparently full of people with long memories and longer grudges. You have history with Castellano, she said. It wasn't a question. Dominic was quiet for a moment. Yes. What kind? He looked at the fire. The firelight did something to his face that softened none of it. The kind that makes this personal for me in ways that are separate from you. She decided to accept that. For now. What do we do next? She said. Tomorrow, you tell me every song, every word, every note, in order, all of them. He looked at her. Then we figure out what they're pointing to. And we figure out how much time we have before Castellano figures it out too. And if he gets there first, he won't. That's not an answer. That's a preference. Something moved in his expression. Almost, but not quite. A concession to the accuracy of that. He won't get there first, Dominic said, because he doesn't have you. She held his gaze. There was nothing comfortable in it, nothing warm exactly. But there was a directness that she found she could orient herself against, the way you orient yourself against a wall in the dark. Something solid, something that didn't shift when she pushed. I need to sleep, she said. Yes. She picked up the ring and put it back in her pocket. She felt him watching her do it, but she didn't look up. At the door she stopped. Why do you care? She said. About the Montanari name, about any of this. She turned back. You could have let me walk out of that penthouse this morning, and none of this would be your problem. He took a long moment. The fire moved. My father, he said, was the man Castellano used to deliver the order in 1994. He said it without inflection, the way you say things that have been processed past the point of emotion into something harder and more permanent. He was 28 years old. He believed he was serving his organization. He didn't know what he was helping to destroy. Another pause. He spent the rest of his life knowing. He died knowing. And he made me understand that certain debts don't expire. She stood in the doorway and absorbed this. So this is about your father's guilt, she said. It's about 30 years of a wrong that nobody has corrected. He met her eyes. And now, for the first time, it might be possible to correct it. She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then she went upstairs. Tucked. She lay on the bed in the east wing room. Actual mattress, actual sheets, the particular warmth of a house that was properly heated. And she stared at the ceiling and could not sleep for a long time. The ring was on the bedside table. She'd taken it out of her pocket and set it there so she could see it. In the lamplight, the silver looked different than it had always looked in the box. Less like a relic, and more like a thing that was still in use, still doing something. She thought about her grandmother's hands, soft and protected. She thought about all the mornings she'd been on the L before sunrise, going to clean other people's spaces. She thought about the hospital room in Oak Park, and the television going and nobody in the room. She kept me safe by keeping me invisible. She kept me invisible until I wasn't, until 4 notes and a held fifth and a return made the wrong man stop breathing. She didn't sleep until after 3. And when she did, she dreamed of a house in Sicily she'd never been to, with light coming through shutters she'd never touched, and a melody moving through the rooms like it was looking for someone. She was woken at 6:48 by the sound of raised voices downstairs. Not Dominic, the voice she didn't recognize. She was on her feet and at the door before she was fully awake, the instinct arriving ahead of the thought. She stood in the hallway in yesterday's clothes and listened. Enzo's voice, controlled but strained. Then the unknown voice, louder, with an accent she couldn't immediately place. Then a third voice, Dominic, low and glacial. Then a sound she'd never heard in person before and recognized instantly from having absorbed it from 1,000 sources she couldn't have named. The specific mechanical sound of a gun being racked. She was at the top of the stairs before she'd decided to be, looking down into the entry hall where Dominic stood with his back to her, facing a man she'd never seen. Early 40s, heavy set, with a face that seemed to have been arranged specifically to communicate threat. 2 other men behind him, both larger. And between all of them, standing in his sweatshirt with his arms at his sides and his breathing gone visibly wrong, was Noah. Noah! She said it before she could stop herself. Every head in the entry hall tilted upward. The man with the threatening face looked at her. And then he smiled, which was worse than the gun. Montanari, he said, in an accent she now recognized as specifically Sicilian. Not to Dominic, to her. We thought we'd come and introduce ourselves. Dominic turned his head very slightly in her direction without taking his eyes off the man. Go back upstairs, he said. His voice was completely level. That levelness was its own kind of alarm. She looked at Noah. Noah's jaw was tight, and his chest was moving wrong, and he was trying to tell her something with his eyes that she was reading as I'm sorry, and don't do anything simultaneously. She didn't go back upstairs. She walked down them. The man watched her come with an expression of visible satisfaction that she wanted to remove from his face with her bare hands. She filed that away and kept moving. She stopped beside Dominic at the bottom of the stairs. Who sent you? She said. The man tilted his head. You know who. I want to hear you say it. Alara, Dominic said very quietly. I want to hear him say it. She held the man's gaze. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them to her thighs and held them there. Because I want to know exactly who decided that walking into a house where my sick brother is sleeping was an acceptable... The heir of the Montanari family, the man said, cutting her off cleanly, does not give us instructions. He looked at Dominic. Mr. Valenti, you understand this isn't personal. This is a message. The girl and the boy come with us. The archive, whatever she knows, whatever she has, is surrendered. These are the terms. The fire was still going in the other room. The house was warm. Somewhere above them, Mrs. Ferrara was presumably awake and doing something practical about this, or she'd already called someone, or both. Dominic said, No. The man's smile didn't change. That's not... I said no. His voice didn't rise. It never rose, she was starting to understand. It just changed density. You walked into my house at 7 in the morning with 3 men and a borrowed gun, and you gave me terms. I want you to think about what that tells me about how much your employer actually respects your judgment. The man's smile went brittle. Leave, Dominic said. Tell Castellano that if he sends anyone to this property again, I will consider it a formal declaration and I will respond accordingly. Those are my terms. The man looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Alara. He can't protect you forever, he said. He doesn't have to protect me forever, she said. Just long enough. She hadn't decided to say that. It arrived fully formed from somewhere she didn't have a name for yet. The man held her gaze for another beat. Then he turned and walked out. His 2 companions followed. The door closed behind them with a quiet click that felt louder than it was. The entry hall was still. Noah exhaled, a long, ragged breath that told her exactly how badly his chest was. She crossed to him in 4 steps, put her hand on his back, felt the work of his breathing under her palm. I'm fine, he said. You're not. Relatively fine. She kept her hand on his back and looked at Dominic, who had turned to face them fully. His expression was controlled, but in the set of his jaw and the particular tension around his eyes, she could see the thing he was carrying. Not fear, not quite. Calculation. And under it, something colder. How did they find this location? She said. He didn't answer immediately. Dominic. There are very few people who know this estate, he said. 3, possibly 4, outside of the people in this house. The implication sat between them. Someone in your organization, she said. He held her gaze. Someone close, she said. We don't know that yet. You know it enough to have that expression. His jaw tightened. Noah was steadying, his breathing finding its rhythm again. Mrs. Ferrara appeared at the end of the hallway with the nebulizer in her hands, already assembled, and Alara felt a violent wave of gratitude toward her that she had no idea what to do with. "Come on," she said to Noah. She guided him toward the back of the house, toward Mrs. Ferrara and the nebulizer and the warm kitchen and everything ordinary. At the doorway she stopped. "The person who told them," she said, without turning around. "When you find out who it is." "Yes," said Dominic. "I want to know." She looked back. "I'm not a passenger in this. Whatever happens next, I'm not—" She stopped, reorganized. "She kept me invisible for 30 years. I'm done with invisible." He looked at her for a long moment. "I know," he said, and the way he said it, quiet, direct, carrying the weight of a morning that had already rearranged several certainties, told her that he did. She turned back to her brother. The door between the hallway and the kitchen had nearly closed behind them when she heard Dominic say, in a voice pitched for Enzo and not for her, a name she'd heard once before, at the Marquette Club. A man who'd shaken Dominic's hand and asked her, with visible social performance, how she was finding Chicago. She stood with her hand on Noah's back and the warm kitchen smell around her and the nebulizer humming to life, and she understood that the person who had given them to Castellano had been in the same room as her last night, smiling at. The name Dominic said was Marco Thierry. Alara stood in the kitchen doorway with her hand on Noah's back and the nebulizer building its steady hum, and she turned the name over once, twice, the way you turn something sharp over in your hand to find the edge. Marco Thierry. The man at the Marquette Club with the good suit and the handshake, and the question about Chicago delivered with the precise warmth of someone who'd practiced being likable until it became indistinguishable from the real thing. She hadn't thought about him twice after leaving the gathering. That was, she understood now, the point. She stayed in the kitchen while Mrs. Ferrara ran Noah through his treatment, sat at the table with both hands wrapped around a mug of coffee she wasn't drinking, and listened to the sound of Dominic's voice from somewhere in the house. Low, controlled, the specific cadence of someone making calls that needed to be made carefully. She couldn't make out words. She didn't try. Noah watched her from across the table when his treatment was done. "You heard something," he said. "Yes? Bad?" "Unclear." She looked at the mug. "Someone at the gathering last night told Castellano's people where we were. Someone Dominic trusted." Noah absorbed this with the particular stillness he used when he was processing information that frightened him and refusing to let it show. He'd developed that stillness in hospital waiting rooms. She recognized it the way you recognize something you've seen formed. "So it's not just the outside that's dangerous," he said. "It never just the outside," she said. "That's the thing nobody tells you." Dominic found her 40 minutes later in the study off the main hall, where she'd gone because it had bookshelves, and she needed the specific comfort of walls lined with things that implied patience. She was standing at the window with the ring in her hand, turning it. The markings on the interior surface caught the gray morning light. He came in and closed the door. "Thierry," she said without turning. "How long has he worked for you?" 11 years. "How senior?" "Senior enough to know this location." A pause. "Senior enough that I brought him to the gathering because I wanted him to see you, to have context." His voice did something she was learning to read, a fractional tightening that was the closest he came to expressing something he didn't want to express. "That was a mistake." "You trusted him?" "Yes." She turned from the window. He was standing near the center of the room, his coat still on, the dark circles under his eyes suggesting he hadn't slept. He looked like a man who'd had something he'd built over years quietly dismantled while he wasn't paying attention, and was now doing the precise, furious work of cataloging the damage. "Where is he now?" she said. We don't know yet. He left the city overnight. Castellano's people have him. Or he went voluntarily." The flatness again. History in it. "We don't know which yet, and it matters." "Why does it matter?" "Because if he was coerced, he gave them this location and a physical description and whatever he overhead at the gathering." He paused. "If he went voluntarily, he gave them everything he's had access to for 11 years. She held the ring tighter. "What does everything include?" Dominic looked at her directly. The remaining people in my network who might help us move against Castellano. Safe locations. Pending arrangements. Another pause, measured. The fact that I've been building a case against Castellano for 4 years. Evidence, financial trails, documented connections to the 1994 attack. Enough to take to certain parties who have reasons of their own to want him exposed. He held her gaze. If Thierry gave them that, Castellano now knows exactly what I've been building. He'll have destroyed or moved whatever he can reach. The 4 years of work, gone, she said. Compromised. Possibly gone. He moved to the desk and sat, which surprised her. She hadn't seen him sit before, and it changed the geometry of the room, made him look briefly like a person with weight rather than a presence that imposed it. The songs, the ring, what you carry, that becomes more important. Not as supporting evidence anymore, as the primary case. She pulled the desk chair out and sat across from him. The ring was on the desk between them. Then let's work, she said. They worked for 3 hours. She sang each melody slowly, and he recorded them on a device she'd never seen before. Compact, no brand markings, while Enzo transcribed by hand in a shorthand she couldn't read. 7 songs. The 8th she was less certain about. Partial, fragmentary, the way things are when you've only ever heard them in a half-awake state on a childhood morning. She gave him what she had. The ring took longer. Dominic had a contact, a man named Presti, reached by phone, who apparently specialized in historical cipher systems, and who conducted the entire conversation in a tone suggesting he'd been waiting decades for someone to call him with exactly this problem. He talked for 20 minutes while Dominic held the phone and listened, and Alara watched his face for signals. When the call ended, Dominic set the phone down. The markings are a coordinate cipher, he said. 18th century format, adapted. The ring is a key. It's meant to be used in conjunction with something else. A surface, a sequence, a document. He looked at the ring. The songs contain the sequence. The ring decodes it. So we have both components, she said. We have both components. He looked up. Presti says the format was used specifically by Sicilian land families for hiding deed records and financial documents in locations that wouldn't survive confiscation. The original archive could be physical, a vault, a room, somewhere on the original Montanari property. Which is where? Western Sicily, a coastal estate. What's left of it is a ruin. The properties were seized and stripped 30 years ago, but the land itself... He paused. The land reverted to municipal ownership when the family was declared extinct. It's been sitting. Waiting, she said. Waiting, he agreed. She felt something move in her chest. Not hope exactly. Something more like the first recognition of a direction. It was Noah who found the discrepancy. She hadn't meant to involve him. She'd given him the laptop and the transcribed song lyrics and Presti's notes as occupational therapy. Something to keep his mind moving while his body did what it needed to do. She'd expected him to read and nod and ask careful questions at the edges. Instead, he came to the study door at 2 p.m. with the laptop under his arm and an expression she hadn't seen on him in years, alert in a specific way, the way he'd looked at 17 when he was solving things. There are 8 songs, he said, not 7. She looked up. I know. The 8th one is partial. No. He came in and set the laptop on the desk, turning it so she and Dominic could see. I mean, there are 8, and the 8th one isn't partial. It's a different construction. Look, he pointed at the transcription. The first 7 have the same melodic structure, descending line, held note, return, like a question and an answer. The 8th one doesn't do that. It ends on the held note. It doesn't return. He was right. She could hear it as soon as he said it, the way that melody had always felt unfinished to her, how she'd assumed it was because she'd only half learned it. It's not unfinished, she said slowly. It's a different type of instruction, Noah said. The first 7 are a sequence. The 8th is a termination point. It's telling you where to stop. He looked between them. The coordinate system needs an endpoint. That's the 8th song. That's the final location marker. Dominic was looking at Noah with an expression Alara couldn't fully read. Not surprise, exactly. Something more like recognition. You're sure, Dominic said. I'm not sure of anything in this situation, Noah said plainly. But mathematically, structurally, that's what it looks like. Dominic looked at Alara. He's right. I know he is, she said. Noah stood there with his laptop and his sweatshirt and his too young face, and Alara felt the familiar combination of pride and terror that was the specific product of loving someone capable in a dangerous situation. Go back upstairs, she said. Alara, Noah, please. He looked at Dominic. Dominic gave him nothing. Noah looked back at his sister, and whatever he read in her face made him close the laptop and leave without further argument. She listened to his footsteps on the stairs, then she looked at Dominic. We need to move towards Sicily, she said. Yes. Which means leaving the country, which means exposure. Yes. And Castellano will be watching every exit. Yes. She took a breath. You have people who can get us out. I had people. He said it without self-pity, which made it worse. I'm working with a smaller network now, the ones I'm certain weren't compromised. It'll take 2 days to arrange. 2 days in a house that Castellanos' people had already found once. She didn't say it, he knew it. Then we use 2 days, she said. The call came at 9 that night. She was in her room when she heard it. Not the call itself, but the aftermath. The change in the house's atmosphere, the way sound moves differently when something is shifted. She was on the stairs before the quality of the silence fully resolved, and she found Dominic in the main hall with his phone in his hand and an expression she hadn't seen on him before. It was the expression of a man who had been hit somewhere he hadn't protected because he hadn't thought it needed protecting. Enzo was beside him. Enzo's face was doing something complicated. What happened? She said. Dominic looked up at her from the bottom of the stairs. Presti, he said. The man I called this afternoon. She felt it before he said it. He's dead, Dominic said. His office was accessed approximately 2 hours after our call. He was found by his assistant an hour ago. The stair railing was under her hand. She gripped it. They were monitoring your calls, she said. A tap I didn't know about. Thierry had access to my communications. His voice was doing the flat thing again, but underneath it now was something that hadn't been there before. Something that burned cold. They know Presti interpreted the ring. They know we have both components. They know we're moving towards Sicily. Do they know the 8th song? They know there is one. He looked at her. They don't have the content. That's only in your head. Only in her head. She processed the implication of that and felt it settle against her sternum like something with physical weight. So, I'm not just useful to you, she said. I'm the only thing standing between Castellano and what he's been looking for 30 years. Yes, he said. He didn't dress it up. And now he knows that. Yes. She came down the rest of the stairs. She stood on the ground floor and looked at him directly, and took a breath that she made as even as she could manage. Thierry, she said, if you went voluntarily, if you told them everything about your 4 years of case building, then the people you were going to take the evidence to, your contacts, are they safe? The pause was half a second too long. Dominic. One of them was reached this afternoon, he said. She's in protective custody. She'll survive, but her cooperation, he stopped. Is gone, Alara finished. Is gone. She stood in the warm hall of the house with the fire in the other room and the sound of Noah's nebulizer running somewhere above her and the full weight of the situation pressing on all surfaces simultaneously. 4 years of built case destroyed. Primary witness compromised. Their location known. Their movements anticipated. Their interpreter dead 2 hours after his only conversation with them. She thought about the fold-out couch, the ridge across her back, the gray uniform, and the laminated badge and the specific invisibility of cleaning someone's marble floors before sunrise. She thought about Nonna Lucia in the hospital room in Oak Park, with the television going and nobody there. She thought about 30 years. The archive, she said. If we find it, what does it contain that Castellano can't simply deny or discredit? Financial instruments, Dominic said. Transfers. Authenticated documents bearing signatures of people who are still living and still powerful. The kind of evidence that doesn't require a cooperative witness because it speaks for itself. He paused. The kind of evidence that, once presented in the right venue, cannot be recalled or suppressed. International jurisdiction. There are parties withstanding to act on it, parties Castellano can't reach. He held her gaze. If we find the archive and we get it to the right hands, it ends. Not just for the Montanari family, for Castellano entirely. Everything he built on the back of what he destroyed. And if we don't find it first, he destroys the property, levels whatever remains of the estate, ensures there's nothing left to find. His jaw. He's been waiting 30 years for a reason to do it. We just gave him the reason. The fire moved in the other room. The clock on the wall marked time with the indifference of clocks. She thought about walking down the stairs that morning when she should have gone back up. She thought about the way she'd said just long enough to the man with the Sicilian accent and the threatening face. She thought about it arriving fully formed from somewhere without a name. She understood now that it hadn't been bravery. It had been something older than bravery, something her grandmother had pressed into her without explanation and without consent, and which was, apparently, not going to let her be invisible anymore, regardless of what she preferred. "I want to talk to Thierry," she said. Dominic blinked. Controlled, fractional, but she saw it. "We don't have him." "Then find him." She held his gaze. Because either he was coerced, in which case he's being held somewhere by Castellano's people and he's a liability they'll eliminate, or he went voluntarily, in which case he'll surface. Either way, I want to talk to him. "He sold us to the people trying to kill you." "I know." She didn't look away. "I want to ask him why, face to face, because 11 years of loyalty doesn't turn overnight, and I want to understand what Castellano offered him that you couldn't." She paused. "I want to understand the architecture of betrayal in this specific situation, because whatever it is, it's a weapon. If I know what he used to turn Thierry, I know what he's using on other people. I know where the other cracks are." The room was quiet. Dominic looked at her for a long time. The fire moved. Enzo, near the door, did not move. "You're thinking like this already," Dominic said. "Not quite a question. I've been managing the architecture of impossible situations my entire adult life," she said. "I was just doing it in a gray uniform." Something shifted in his face. Not softness. Something more structural than that. A recalibration. 2 days, he said. "We move in 2 days." 2 days, she agreed. She turned to go upstairs. She needed to check on Noah. She needed to be in the same room as something she loved for 10 minutes before she went back to thinking about all of this. She was at the foot of the stairs when the motion sensor outside triggered the exterior lights. Not the driveway, not the road. The east perimeter. The tree line, specifically, where the property backed up against 200 yards of old growth that she'd noticed on the drive-in and filed away and not thought about since. Enzo was already moving toward the security panel. Dominic had his phone out. The exterior camera feed resolved on the panel screen. Dark, thermal, the tree line in shades of white and gray, and in the trees, moving with the specific carefulness of people who understood that speed was less important than silence, were 4 distinct heat signatures. Not 3 this time. 4. And behind them, barely at the edge of the thermal range, stationary and watching, a 5th. The 5th one wasn't moving toward the house. The 5th one was already positioned. She understood what that meant a second before Dominic said it, quietly, with the voice he used when the situation had moved past the point of controlled management into something that required a different register entirely. "They're not here to deliver a message this time," he said. Enzo killed the exterior lights. The house went dark except for the fire, and somewhere above them, in the east wing, in the room where she'd left him with his nebulizer and his laptop and his 2 perceptive eyes, Noah. Noah was at the top of the stairs. He'd heard it. Whatever sound the house made when it shifted register, whatever frequency fear travels at through walls and floors, he'd heard it and come out. And now he was standing at the top of the stairs in his sweatshirt with his laptop under his arm and his eyes doing the rapid assessment thing that meant he'd already understood most of it. "East wing," Dominic said, not to Noah, to Enzo. "Now." Enzo moved with a speed that didn't match his 60 years, already talking into a radio in rapid Italian. Dominic had crossed to a panel near the study door that Alara hadn't noticed before, flush with the wall, unlocked by thumbprint, containing 2 handguns and a radio of his own, and what looked like a folded tactical vest. "Alara." His voice was level but stripped of everything except information. Get your brother and go to the basement. Mrs. Ferrara knows the room. Stone walls, reinforced door. It was built for this. Built for this? She repeated. Yes. He was checking the gun with the automatic efficiency of someone who'd done it enough times that thought wasn't required. Go. She took the stairs 2 at a time. Noah met her halfway. How many? He said. 4 that we can see. She grabbed his arm. Come on. Elara? Noah, walk. He walked. She kept her hand on his arm and felt his breathing, elevated, controlled, doing the work. He wasn't in crisis yet. She filed that as the only positive current datum and kept moving. Mrs. Ferrara was already in the kitchen, already had a door open in the far wall that Elara had taken for a pantry. Stone steps going down, lit by a single overhead strip, cold white. Mrs. Ferrara had a bag, medical, she could see the nebulizer components, and the expression of someone who had rehearsed this enough times that emergency had become procedure. The door seals from inside, Mrs. Ferrara said. There's a hardline phone, water, 3 days of supplies. Mr. Valenti's protocol is to wait for the all-clear signal. 4 knocks, pause, 2. I know the protocol, Noah said. Both women looked at him. I read the house documentation when we arrived, he said. There was a binder. Elara stared at him for a half-second. Then she looked at Mrs. Ferrara. Get him downstairs. She turned back toward the hall. Where are you going? Noah said. Back. Elara, I'm not a passenger. She said it without looking at him, because if she looked at him, she would not be able to walk away. That's what I told him. That's what I meant. She heard him say her name again, lower this time, and then she heard Mrs. Ferrara's firm, practical voice and the sound of feet on stone steps, and she kept walking. The main hall was dark. Dominic had cut the interior lights at the secondary panel, and the only illumination now was ambient, the dying fire, the pale gray of the winter dawn beginning through the high windows. It turned the room into shapes and shadows, and the specific unease of familiar spaces made strange. He was near the front door with Enzo and 2 other men she hadn't seen before tonight. Security, presumably, the kind of quiet-moving men who existed in the background of his world. Everyone had weapons. Everyone was positioned with the deliberate geometry of people who knew what was coming. She came in from the kitchen side, and Dominic turned before she reached him because he seemed to always know where she was. And his expression when he saw her was not surprise and not approval and not anything she could name quickly. I told you. I know what you told me. She stopped beside him. I'm not going in the basement. If they're here for me, having me in a sealed room doesn't end this. It just concentrates it. They'll burn the house down to get to that room if they have to. His jaw moved. You don't know that. Castellano has been waiting 30 years. He sent 5 people tonight, not 3. He's not sending a message anymore. She held his gaze in the near dark. If I'm visible, if they can see me and talk to me, there's a negotiation, there's a surface. That's something you can work with. I'm not using you as bait. I'm not asking your permission. She said it clean without heat. I'm telling you my analysis. Use it or don't. Something moved through his expression. Fast, complex, several things at once. He looked at Enzo. Enzo gave the microscopic shrug of a man who has learned not to argue with correct assessments from unexpected sources. Outside, somewhere in the tree line, a branch cracked. One of the security men near the window adjusted his position fractionally. Stay behind me, Dominic said. Beside you, she said. He looked at her for one more second. Then he turned to face the door. They came through this east side entry, a service door that Dominic had apparently expected them to identify because his men were already flanking it when it opened. The first man through took 2 steps into the kitchen and found himself in a geometry that didn't favor him. He stopped. The others came through more carefully after that. 4 men, as the thermal had shown. The one she recognized, heavy-set, Sicilian accent, the one who'd smiled at her yesterday morning, was not among them. These were different. Younger, harder, moving with a professional economy that told her they weren't messengers. The standoff lasted approximately 45 seconds. She counted them. Then the front door opened. The 5th figure from the tree line. He was older than she'd expected. 60, perhaps. not the 71 Dominic had described. But time does different things to different people, and the man who walked through the front door of the Barrington estate carried his age the way some men carry weight, forward, leading with it, using it. He was short and heavy-set, and he had the kind of face that had probably once been conventionally handsome and had since been reshaped by decades of being the most important person in every room he entered. He was wearing a coat that cost as much as a car and carrying nothing in his hands. He looked at Dominic first. The look had 30 years in it. Then he looked at Alara. She had prepared herself for many things in the last 24 hours. She had not prepared herself for the specific quality of Rafael Castellano's attention, which was not threatening in any obvious way and was therefore more threatening than anything obvious could have been. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has invested a great deal in finding. "You look like your grandmother," he said. His English was precise, faintly accented, each word placed with care. "Around the eyes." She said nothing. "She was a remarkable woman. I want you to know I respected her. What happened in 1994 was—" He paused, choosing his word. "Necessary. Not personal." "You destroyed my family," she said. Her voice came out steady. She noted this as information about herself. "I protected mine." He moved further into the room, and his 4 men adjusted around him like a tide. Dominic's men held their positions. The room was a grid of angles and loaded decisions. "Your great-grandfather built a weapon and aimed it at everyone. The documentation he compiled, do you understand what it would have done? Not just to me, to everyone. Families that had operated in good faith, arrangements that kept peace between—" "I don't want a justification," she said. "I want to understand what you think is going to happen tonight." He studied her. Something shifted in his expression. She read it as recalibration, the adjustment of someone who had expected a frightened housekeeper and was encountering something that wasn't. "The archive," he said simply. "You know where it is? You have the cipher key?" His eyes moved to her jacket pocket, which was where the ring was and which he knew about because Thierry had told him, and Thierry had seen her touch that pocket a dozen times since the Marquette Club. "You give me the ring, and you tell me the location, the sequence, all of it." He held her gaze. "And you and your brother live, comfortably, whatever medical care he requires, whatever life you want to build. I have resources, and I have reach, and I have absolutely no interest in harming a young woman who simply had the misfortune of being her grandmother's granddaughter." "And Dominic," she said. The brief silence was its own answer. Dominic Valenti made his choices. Castellano's voice didn't change. "Those choices have consequences that exist independently of you." She felt Dominic beside her. Not movement. Absence of movement. The specific stillness of someone who is processing something they already knew but are now feeling the full weight of. "You came here yourself," she said to Castellano. "Tonight, personally." "Yes." "Why?" He tilted his head slightly. "Because the archive isn't just about the past," she said. She was thinking out loud now, faster than she could fully track, the connections forming as she spoke them. "It's not just about the 1994 arrangements. The documentation your great-grandfather built over 40 years, it doesn't stop in 1994. Your family kept adding to it, because that's what that kind of system does once it exists. It keeps collecting." She watched his face. "The archive has documentation that extends past the massacre, documentation of what you did afterward, who you paid, what you built on top of what you took." She held his gaze. "You came yourself because you can't afford to trust anyone else to make sure it's actually destroyed. Because if even a fraction of what's in that archive surfaces, it doesn't just end your reputation. It ends you." The room was completely still. Castellano looked at her for a long moment. "Remarkable," he said quietly. And she could hear that it was genuine. Then he nodded to the man on his left. Everything happened in approximately 3 seconds. Dominic moved fast, left, creating distance and drawing fire toward himself and away from her, which was not something she'd agreed to, and which she processed as both tactically sound and personally infuriating in the single second she had to process anything. Enzo moved right. The 2 security men engaged the nearest of Castellano's people with the controlled efficiency of men in their specific profession. Castellano himself didn't move. He stood in the center of the room and watched his men and Dominic's men resolve their geometry around him and looked like a man who had seen this many times before and found it neither exciting nor distressing. She ran, not away, toward him. She crossed the distance between them before anyone registered what she was doing, before Castellano's remaining flanking man could reposition, before Castellano himself could revise his expectations. And she stopped 8 inches from him with her hand in her jacket pocket and the ring closed in her fist and her breathing loud in her own ears. "Tell them to stop," she said. He looked down at her from his several inches of height advantage. His expression was thoughtful. "You're not armed," he said. "I have the ring." She held his gaze. "And the 8th song is only in my head. If anything happens to me, anything, you lose everything. The coordinates, the cipher, the location, 30 years of hunting, and you lose it in this house because you couldn't stop for 30 seconds. I could take the ring from you." "Yes." She didn't step back. "And then what? Torture me? I grew up cleaning other people's floors. I know what it means to hold something until it breaks you. You torture me. You risk me dying without giving you what you need, or you risk me giving you falsified information, or you risk the kind of damage that makes me genuinely unable to remember." She kept her eyes on his. "Your best chance has always been negotiation. That's why you came yourself. You knew that." The sounds of physical struggle in the room behind her. Something breaking. Dominic's voice, sharp and short. She did not turn around. Castellano looked at her. "What are you offering?" he said. "A meeting," she said. "Formal. Neutral ground. 3 days. You, me, Dominic, and whoever you want to bring to witness. I present the archive. You acknowledge what was done to the Montanari family in 1994. Not publicly, not in any venue that legally implicates you. A private acknowledgement, witnessed, on record only between the parties present." She swallowed. "The contested territories, the land taken from the Montanari family, are returned or compensated. The documentation that pertains specifically to your current operations is sealed. Not destroyed, sealed. In custody, that is not mine and not yours. And the documentation from 1994 goes to international jurisdiction," she said, "where it has always belonged." His eyes hadn't moved from hers. Behind her the sounds had shifted. Lower, less chaotic. Someone had stopped someone. She didn't know who had stopped whom, and she was not going to find out by turning around. "You're 25 years old," Castellano said. "You were cleaning windows 3 days ago." "Yes," she said. "And my grandmother was carrying this for 30 years in a country that wasn't hers, in a life that wasn't meant to be hers. And she died without telling me why, because she was protecting me." Something moved in her voice, and she let it move, because she couldn't stop it anyway. And maybe it was useful. "She didn't protect me so I could give you the archive in the dark. She protected me so I could be standing here telling you that what you did has consequences, that it didn't disappear, that the bloodline you thought you erased is still here and is looking at you and is offering you the most reasonable terms you are ever going to receive." Her grip on the ring tightened, her knuckles ached. "So stop your men, sit down, and let's talk about what this costs." Castellano was quiet for a long time. The fire in the other room had burned low. The cold from outside pressed against the windows. The gray dawn was arriving, whether anyone in this room was ready for it. He looked past her shoulder. "Dominic," he said. A pause. "I'm here." Dominic's voice from behind her and to the right. Controlled, strained at the very edges in a way she hadn't heard before. She still didn't turn. "You'll accept these terms," Castellano said. Not a question, an assessment. Another pause. Shorter. "I'll accept a conversation," Dominic said, "with conditions." Castellano looked back at Alara. Something moved through his expression, complex, layered, the specific expression of a powerful man encountering a situation that has moved outside the parameters he prepared for. She had seen that expression before, not on anyone this dangerous. But she had seen it. He looked at the man to his left. "Stand down," he said. The room changed. She felt it in the air, the specific pressure release of a situation pulling back from the edge. Weapons didn't disappear, positions didn't dissolve, but the immediate forward motion stopped. She exhaled slowly through her nose and kept her face as neutral as she could make it, while her heart was striking the inside of her sternum with a violence that she was certain must be visible. Then she turned. Dominic was standing 6 feet away with blood at the corner of his mouth and his shirt torn at the left shoulder, and his eyes on her with an expression that was doing several things simultaneously that she didn't have time to catalog. One of Castellano's men was on the floor against the wall, down but conscious, holding his ribs. Enzo had a cut above his eye. The 2 security men were standing. Dominic looked at her. She looked at him. "Still standing," she said. His jaw was tight, his breathing visible. "You walked up to him?" "Yes." "Without a weapon?" "I had the ring." "Elara." He said her name with a specific weight that wasn't anger and wasn't fear and wasn't anything she had a clean label for. "It worked," she said. "It worked," he repeated. "So?" She turned back to the room. The cold gray morning pressed at the windows. Castellano stood in the center of the space, watching. His men stood at their various positions. The fire was almost completely dead. "We need a neutral venue, water, and someone needs to go downstairs and tell my brother that he can stop whatever he's been planning down there for the last 15 minutes, because I know him, and I know he hasn't just been sitting quietly, and whatever it is, it's not necessary." Nobody spoke for a moment. Then, from somewhere below the floor, from the sealed basement room with its hardline phone and its 3 days of supplies and its reinforced door, 4 knocks. A pause. 2. Not the all-clear signal. The all-clear signal was supposed to come from outside. It was coming from inside. She looked at Dominic. He looked at the floor. "What does that mean?" she said. He crouched down and picked up the radio from where it had fallen during the fight. He held it to his mouth. He said Noah's name. Static. Then Noah's voice, slightly breathless, carrying the specific quality of someone who has done something they are moderately confident was the right decision and is approximately 40% certain they're about to be in significant trouble for it. "I used the hard line," Noah said. "I called the number in the binder, the contact for, it says, international arrangements." A pause. "They're already moving. They said they've been waiting for this call for 4 years. Another pause. "I hope that was the right thing to do. The binder said to use it if the situation escalated to direct confrontation, and it seemed like that's what—" Dominic closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Elara pressed her fingers to her mouth. "That," said Noah, "is the part where someone tells me if I helped." She turned to look at Castellano, who was looking at Dominic, whose expression had shifted into something that was, for the first time, something adjacent to uncertainty. Because 4 years of case building, compromised and destroyed by a traitor's phone call, that work hadn't gone entirely. It had been waiting. It had been packaged and prepared and sitting in the hands of a contact in an international office somewhere, waiting for exactly 1 phone call from exactly 1 hardline number in a basement in Barrington, Illinois. And Noah, with his laptop and his sweatshirt and his 2 perceptive eyes, had found the binder. She looked at Castellano. "The terms I offered you," she said, "just became significantly less generous. Because the window you had 30 seconds ago has already—" The window closed in the time it took Castellano to understand what had happened. She watched it move across his face. The recalculation, the rapid internal accounting of a man who had spent 50 years staying ahead of consequences and was now, for perhaps the first time, behind them. It wasn't panic. Men like Castellano didn't panic. It was something more controlled and therefore more revealing. The specific expression of someone deciding, in real time, how much to cut their losses and in which direction to run. He looked at his 4 men. Then he looked at Dominic. Then he looked at Elara. "The contact Noah called," she said. "How long before they move?" Dominic's voice came from behind her, still slightly hoarse. "Hours, not days." She nodded. She kept her eyes on Castellano. "So here's where we are. The international arrangement your people didn't know existed is now in motion. The documentation in that system is procedurally protected, meaning your people can't reach it, can't suppress it, can't negotiate it away at the level you'd need to negotiate it away at." She paused. "What you can still control is how the next 72 hours look, whether you're characterized as someone who cooperated or someone who didn't." Castellano's jaw moved almost imperceptibly. "The archive," he said, "will be found. With or without your cooperation. The songs are in my head, and the ring is in my hand, and I know the property, and I know the sequence. She kept her voice level. Your cooperation changes what happens after it's found, not whether. The room held its positions. Nobody moved. The gray dawn outside had strengthened into something closer to actual morning, thin winter light pressing through the high windows and making the shadows retreat to the corners. She could see the blood at Dominic's mouth more clearly now. She could see the way he was holding his left arm slightly forward, protecting something. Ribs, probably. She filed it. Castellano looked at the floor for a moment. Not weakness, processing. The kind of man who showed you he was thinking rather than hiding, that he was thinking. Because the thinking itself was meant to be visible, meant to communicate that the decision was being made with appropriate weight. He looked up. The 1994 documentation goes to jurisdiction, he said, as you proposed. Yes. My current operations are sealed. Yes. And the Montanari territories are returned, or compensated at current market value by independent assessment. She didn't waver. Those are the terms. They haven't changed. The private acknowledgement, he said, witnessed and sealed. Witnessed by parties acceptable to both sides. Sealed in a depository neither of us controls. She held his gaze. It's not absolution. I'm not offering that, and I wouldn't if I could. It's a record. It exists. What happened to my family exists in documentation, acknowledged by the man who ordered it, and it does not disappear. She felt something move in her throat and swallowed it. That matters to me. That's what I'm asking for on top of everything else. That it doesn't disappear. The room was very quiet. Castellano looked at her for a long time with the morning light coming in, and the dead fire, and the evidence of the night's violence in the arrangement of bodies around the room. He looked at her like he was seeing something he hadn't expected to see and was deciding what to do with the fact of it. Agreed, he said. He said it once, quietly, and then he was quiet. Met. His men left first. Then Castellano himself, at the door, paused with his hand on the frame and looked back into the room. Not at Dominic, at Alara. Your grandmother, he said. I want you to know she had the opportunity to surface twice in 30 years. She chose not to. She chose you. He paused. I don't know if that's comfort or not. I imagine it's both. She said nothing. He left. The door closed. The house exhaled. Dominic sat down on the floor. Not dramatically. He simply reached the end of what his body was willing to do standing up, and he sat back against the wall, left arm held at the careful angle that confirmed the ribs. His head went back against the wall, and his eyes closed for a moment, and he looked, for the first and only time she'd seen, like a man who was tired. Enzo crouched beside him, said something in Italian. Dominic said something back. Enzo stood, produced a phone, began making calls. Alara crossed the room and sat on the floor beside Dominic. He opened his eyes, looked at her sideways. You walked up to him, he said again. You keep saying that. Because I keep thinking about it. It worked. You didn't know it would work. No, she agreed. I knew it was the option with the best available odds. She looked at her hands in her lap. The ring was still in her right fist. She opened her fingers and looked at it. The smooth silver, the worn markings, the weight of it that was almost nothing and somehow everything. I grew up calculating which bad option was least bad. That's not bravery. That's just arithmetic. He was quiet for a moment. Your brother, he said. I know. He called an international office from a basement using a hardline number from a binder he found on arrival. I know. He's 22. He's always been like that. She closed her fingers around the ring again. He reads things. He absorbs things. He had 40 minutes in that basement, and he used all 40 of them. She felt something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight since the night before, since the morning before, since 3 years ago, probably. I need to go get him. Yes. She stood. He watched her from the floor with his careful eyes and his torn shirt and the blood drying at the corner of his mouth. Your ribs, she said. 2, maybe 3. I've had worse. That's a terrible thing to have to be able to say. Something moved in his expression, almost a smile. Not quite. The closest she'd seen. "Go get your brother," he said. Then Noah was standing at the top of the basement stairs when she opened the kitchen door. He had his laptop under his arm and his jaw set in the expression that meant he'd been preparing for multiple conversational outcomes and was ready for all of them. She looked at him. He looked at her. She crossed the kitchen and put her arms around him and held on, which was something she almost never did because there had always been something to do next, always a task that required her hands, always a reason to be moving instead of still. He was stiff for exactly 1 second, and then he wasn't, and he put his arm around her and she felt the careful work of his breathing against her shoulder, and she held on until the thing in her chest finished loosening. "I didn't know if the binder was current," he said, into her shoulder. "It was current. I wasn't sure." "You did it anyway." "You walked downstairs toward 5 people," he said. "So." She pulled back and looked at him. His face was pale and tired, and there were circles under his eyes, and he had the careful stillness of someone who had spent the last hour and a half in a sealed room, not knowing if the people he loved were alive. "You're okay," she said. "Relatively," he said. And the way he said it now was different from every time before. Not a deflection, not a joke that had worn thin, just a fact. Relative to all available alternatives, they were okay. She touched his face once, briefly, the way their mother used to, and then she let go, and they both understood that the gesture had said what it needed to say. "Mrs. Ferrara has coffee," he said. "Good." They went to find it. Quote. The next 72 hours were procedural in the way that the aftermath of enormous things is always procedural. A succession of calls, arrangements, the careful disassembly of crisis into manageable components. Dominic's international contact turned out to be a retired prosecutor with an office in Geneva and a 20-year history of building exactly the kind of case that 4 years of Dominic's work had been designed to feed. The procedural protections Noah had activated by making that call from the basement meant that the documentation was already in motion through channels that Castellano's reach didn't extend to. Thierry surfaced on the second day. Not in Castellano's custody. He'd never been. He'd left voluntarily, as Dominic had suspected, offered a sum of money large enough to retire on by Castellano's intermediary, communicated through a channel that Thierry had apparently been maintaining as insurance for at least 2 years. When the scope of what had happened became clear, he didn't run. He called Enzo and said he wanted to talk. Alara was in the room when they brought him in. He was smaller than she remembered from the Marquette Club. Not physically, but in the way that people become smaller when the context that made them significant is removed. He was 45, with a good face that had been doing dishonest work for 2 years and was now doing the specific work of a man who knows the bill has arrived. He looked at Dominic, then at Alara. "I want to explain," he said. "Then explain," Dominic said. He was standing near the window. His ribs were taped under his shirt. His voice was level in the way it always was, but she had learned by now to read the density. Thierry sat down. He put his hands on the table. "My daughter," he said. "She's been sick for 3 years. The treatment she needs, it's experimental. It's not covered. The cost is—" He stopped. "Castellano's people came to me 14 months ago. They said they knew about her. They said they could fund the treatment, all of it, indefinitely." He looked at the table. "They didn't ask for much at first, small things, information about scheduling, peripheral things." He paused. And then the Montanari name came up, and the things they wanted weren't small anymore. The room was quiet. Alara looked at him. She thought about the medication costs and the collections notices and the fold-out couch and the $240 she'd needed on a Thursday. She thought about what she would have done, what calculations she would have run, if someone had come to her with that offer when Noah was sicker, when the options were fewer, when the arithmetic of impossible choices had been even more impossible than it usually was. She didn't like what she thought. "Is your daughter still in treatment?" she said. Thierry looked at her. He hadn't expected the question. "Yes," he said. She nodded. She looked at Dominic. He held her gaze. Then he looked at Thierry. "The treatment continues," he said. "On my arrangement. Not his." His voice was flat but not cruel. "You're done with this work. You understand that?" Thierry's jaw worked. He nodded. And the information you gave them, Dominic said. All of it. You're going to spend the next 2 days with Enzo going through every detail of what you said to whom and when. Everything. You understand that too? Yes. Then we're done for now. Thierry left. The room held his absence for a moment. Elara sat with her coffee and looked at the table where his hands had been. You didn't have to do that, she said. The treatment. I know. His daughter didn't make the choice he made. No, Dominic said. She didn't. He moved away from the window. He sat across from her, which was still something she noticed when he did it, the particular shift in the room's dynamic. Children rarely do. She thought about that. She thought about herself, cleaned and scrubbed and pressed invisible by a protection she hadn't known she was wearing. She thought about Nonna Lucia choosing silence for 30 years. She did the best she could, Elara said. Not to Dominic, to herself, to the table, to the woman who had died in Oak Park with the television going. She did the only thing she knew how to do. She made me small so they couldn't find me. She looked up. She just didn't account for the songs. She counted on the songs, Dominic said quietly. Elara went still. She could have stopped singing them at any point in 30 years, he said. She didn't. She taught them to you, specifically, carefully, in the right order. He held her gaze. She kept you invisible, and she kept the key in your memory, and she waited. For what? I don't know. For it to be safe, maybe. For you to be ready. For circumstances to change. He paused. She gave you everything you needed, and she trusted you to find the rest when the time came. She sat with that for a long time. She wasn't sure if it made it better. She wasn't sure that better was the right metric anymore. It made it truer, maybe. More complete. The picture of her grandmother that existed in her memory shifted, not into someone different, but into someone fuller, a woman who had been frightened and careful and human, and who had loved her imperfectly and with everything available. That felt like enough to stand on. What? They went to Sicily 3 weeks later. The Montanari estate was on a coastal hillside 40 minutes from Palermo, or what remained of it was. The main house had been stripped and partially demolished in the decades since the seizure, the stone walls still standing in some sections and collapsed in others, the land gone to scrub and wild fennel, and the particular hardy vegetation of places that have been left to make their own decisions. The sea was visible from the highest point of the property, and the light was extraordinary, clear and particular in the way Nonna Lucia had described, the way Elara had somehow always known it would be. The archive was not in the main house. It was under it. The eighth song's coordinates, decoded through the ring's cipher, led to a storage vault cut into the bedrock beneath the eastern foundation, accessible through a section of floor that had been deliberately obscured by construction, sealed with materials that had held against 30 years of abandonment in Sicilian climate with a thoroughness that suggested the Montanari patriarch had understood that 30 years was not an unreasonable timeline to plan for. The documentation inside was physical, paper, leather-bound volumes, a collection of sealed containers with wax preservation that had done its work. 40 years of records, financial instruments, correspondence, formal agreements, documented arrangements between parties who had believed themselves protected by the destruction of the family that had assembled the evidence against them. Elara stood in the vault with a flashlight and looked at the shelves and felt the specific vertigo of standing inside something that people had died for. Dominic stood beside her. Your great-grandfather built this over 40 years, he said. And then he trusted it to a melody and a ring and the chance that someone would still be alive to use them. He didn't know it would be me, she said. No, he didn't know it would be anyone. He just built it and hid it and hoped. She looked at the sealed containers, the careful rows. That's an enormous amount of faith to put into the future. Or an enormous amount of stubbornness, Dominic said. She almost laughed. It surprised her. The almost laugh, arriving from somewhere she hadn't known, still had access to that particular response. She pressed her fingers to her mouth and looked at the archive and let the moment be what it was. But this... The formal proceedings took 4 months, not a trial. The jurisdiction was civil and international, the process designed for exactly this kind of documentation, the kind that doesn't require living witnesses because the documents themselves constitute testimony. Castellano's legal representation made 2 attempts to challenge the archive's provenance and abandoned both when it became clear that the preservation and the cipher trail in the chain of custody were airtight in ways that no challenge could fully address. The private acknowledgement happened in a room in Geneva with 5 witnesses and a notary and no cameras. Castellano sat across from Ilara and read a prepared statement acknowledging the events of 1994, the identity of the parties involved, and the consequent destruction of the Montanari family line as he had understood it to exist at the time. He read it in a flat voice and did not look up from the paper. Ilara sat and listened and kept her hands still in her lap. When he finished, she said, "Thank you. Not for the acknowledgement, not for the record. For finishing, for staying in the room long enough to say it out loud, even in that flat voice, even without looking up. It had been said. It existed now in a way it hadn't existed before. That was what she had asked for, and that was what she received, and she was not going to pretend it was more than it was, or less." Castellano stood and left without further conversation. His lawyer followed. Ilara sat in the room for a few minutes after, alone, with the notarized document in front of her and the sound of Geneva outside the window and the weight of the morning settling around her. She put the ring on the table, looked at it, the smooth silver, the worn markings, the soft glint of a gray European winter. She picked it up and put it back on her finger. Nut. The Montanari estate was returned through the legal mechanism established by the civil proceedings, formally, by deed, with the appropriate municipal filings and international documentation. The reconstruction would take years. She understood that going in and did not find it discouraging. She had spent her adult life maintaining things that were wearing out with resources that were barely sufficient, and she understood the slow work of repair in a way that made it feel like familiar ground rather than obstacle. Noah enrolled in a program in Milan, computational mathematics, which was the subject he'd been quietly learning on his own for 2 years, because the medication costs had made university feel theoretical. His treatment was ongoing and stable. He had a studio apartment with a decent view and a coffee maker that he used with the seriousness of a person who has decided that certain small things are going to be done correctly. He called her every other day, usually in the evenings when the light was going and she was on the east terrace of the partly restored estate looking at the sea. "How's the construction?" he said. "Loud," she said. "How are you?" "Standing," she said. He understood that. He always had. 6 months after Geneva, Dominic found her on the east terrace in the early evening. The sea was doing its particular thing with the last light, turning it over, handing it back, changed. Below the terrace, the property's reconstruction crews had gone home for the day, and the scaffolding stood against the west wall like the skeleton of something in progress. He had recovered from the ribs in the first few weeks, from the other things more slowly. Not the physical things, those healed in the ordinary way. The slower recovery was from Thierry, from 11 years of misplaced trust, from the specific wound of discovering that loyalty has a price and that the price is sometimes payable by someone other than you. She'd watched that recovery without commenting on it because she understood it was not a process that benefited from commentary. She had her own equivalent wounds, and she was engaged in her own equivalent process, and they had an unspoken agreement about that, about the simultaneous privacy and company of it. He came to stand beside her at the terrace railing. They looked at the sea for a while. "Presti's family," she said. "The fund. Established, monthly, for the daughter's education." He'd arranged it in the 3rd week, quietly, without announcement. She'd found out from Enzo. "It won't fix it," he said. "No," she said. "But it's the thing you could do, so you did it. That's what it is." He was quiet. "Your father," she said. "Yes." "He spent his life knowing." "Yes." She looked at the sea. "Do you think it's enough? This. What happened? Does it—" She paused. "Does it settle it for him?" Dominic was quiet for a long moment. The light on the water changed. "I don't know," he said. "I think it settles it for me." He paused. "I think he would have said that was the part that mattered." She nodded. They stood with the sea doing its evening work below them and the scaffolding against the wall and the smell of the wild fennel that had been growing on this land without anyone's permission for 30 years and intended to continue. He turned to face her. She had seen him in many registers now, Commanding, calculating, controlled, briefly and privately undone, recovered. She had seen his face do the work of a man who carries the weight of his history forward because there is no other direction to carry it. She knew the specific density of his voice when something mattered. She knew the almost smile that was the closest he usually came. He was not almost smiling now. He was looking at her with the full quality of attention that she'd first felt in the penthouse at 5:30 in the morning with the cleaning equipment in her hand and the city dark outside the window, and which had not diminished in any of the intervening months, and which she had stopped trying to find a manageable category for. He reached into his coat pocket. What he took out was not a ring. It was a small folded paper, which he held out to her without explanation. She took it, unfolded it. A deed. A property transfer document, formally executed, bearing her name and the address of the Montanari estate. Not proposed. Already done. Already filed. "This was yours before any of this started," he said. "I wanted to make sure it was yours before I said anything else." She looked at the document. She looked at him.
"Before you said anything else?" she repeated. "Yes." She waited. He was not a man who made speeches. She had understood that about him early and found it increasingly one of the things about him that she trusted most. He said what was true, and he said it once, and he did not dress it in language that was more comfortable than accurate.
"I'm not the same person I was 4 months ago," he said, "or 8 months ago. I'm not sure I'm the same person I was before you hummed 4 notes in my apartment at 5 in the morning." He held her gaze. "I don't know what to do with that except tell you." She folded the deed carefully, put it in her own pocket. "You could also," she said, "ask me something." He looked at her. Something moved in his face. The full, unguarded version of what she'd seen partial glimpses of across months of impossible circumstances. He reached into the same coat pocket, and this time what he took out was a ring. Not the Montanari silver band, something different, something chosen. Simple and considered in the same way he was simple and considered. He didn't kneel. He was not a man who knelt. He stood at the terrace railing with the sea behind him and the evening light on his face and held it out the way he did everything, directly, without performance, without the softening that would have made it easier and also less true. "Marry me," he said. Not a question, an offer. His exact version of asking, which she had come to understand was also the most honest version she was ever going to receive from anyone. She looked at the ring in his hand. She thought about the gray uniform, the rubber band in her hair, the fold-out couch and the ridge and the laminated badge. She thought about the morning she'd hummed 4 notes and turned around and found her entire life already in the process of becoming something else. She thought about her grandmother's hands, soft, protected, carrying something silently across an ocean and through 3 decades, and into the specific morning when Elara had stood at a window cleaning glass before sunrise and let an old melody find the air. She took the ring. She put it on. "Yes," she said. Below the terrace, the sea turned the last light over and gave it back as something the day hadn't started with. The fennel moved in the evening wind. The scaffolding stood against the wall of a house being rebuilt from what had been left. She leaned against the railing and looked at the water and felt the specific hard-won quality of a moment that has been paid for in full. Not easily, not without cost, not without the kind of loss that doesn't fully resolve, but paid. Complete. Hers. Beside her, Dominic looked at the sea. His hand found hers on the railing. They stood there while the light finished its work and the evening came in from the water, unhurried, carrying the smell of salt and wild fennel and the particular Sicilian dark that Nonna Lucia had described once, quietly, in a kitchen in Chicago, to a girl who had been listening without knowing she was memorizing. The girl had grown into the woman standing on the terrace of a house her blood had built, and her blood had lost, and her blood had taken back. The song had found its ending, and it was nothing like silence.